To time. Next, I will request Shantanu Majee to come over the podium and present his paper, which is titled Prioritizing Pedagogy in Victorian Studies from the Global South. He is the Assistant Professor, Techno India University.
Thank you, sir. It gives me sheer delight to share this panel with Odithro and Orusharko, people whom I have been, noticing to grow in years and knowledge also, and Orpon, whom I came to know lately. Such a pleasure. It's difficult to possibly compress years of work into a 10-minute presentation, but I will surely try to do my best. My PhD is on intellectual labor and Victorian women, and through this presentation, which I hope you will enjoy in today's panel, I tend to critique ways in which Victorian studies are taught in Indian universities. And by doing so, I appeal to bring in a change in trying to look at the nature and shape of Victorian studies here and now, and in doing so, try to make ourselves aware of the positionalities from which we, as post-colonial Indians, tend to look at the discipline of Victorian studies. In bringing you to the theoretical construct of this word, let me quickly refer to very two important words that has shaped my idea of undisciplining the Victorian classroom. And the first is this movement called undisciplining Victorian studies, which came to exist around 2020. We had these three Asian women professors teaching in the American universities who tend to come up with this revolutionary essay called Undisciplining Victorian Studies as a response to Black Lives Matter and contemporary political movements in the West. And they ask us to set out to think carefully and deliberately about how we need to truly relate what we are teaching in class with what happens around us. Almost in the similar time, we have Shukonna Banerjee and others coming up with a 2021 special issue on widening the 19th century, where Shukonna talks about this very interesting notion of looking at our discourses through a trans-imperial framework. This idea of trans-imperialism is of much value to me. Trans-imperialism affords the possibility of bringing together several coexisting practices. For instance, let's say if as a student of Victorian studies, I'm looking at 19th century English literature and 19th century Urdu literature, rather than forcing myself to engage in a comparative analysis of, let's say, representative texts from Urdu and representative texts in English, a trans-imperial framework will enable me to try and look how these texts have been trying to respond to global phenomena, let's say colonial modernity. So rather than restricting myself to a comparative analysis on the basis of a closed reading of a text, I'm trying to possibly liberate the text from the notion of what Shukonna terms as coevality, which outlines the specific disruptions of the linear model of studies that we tend to replicate in our classroom practices, and tend to look out for individual truths that these texts have to offer in their own terms. Can you just move on to the next slide? Yes, so this is the text that I've been talking about by Ronjuni and others. And also the next slide, please. The other idea is to what is the value of pedagogy in our classrooms. And I am totally chiming with what Onukta had to say in this brilliant plenary at the beginning of these days' proceedings, that when we talk about the discourse in the university, we seem to be more at home in thinking of theory as something which hardly has any connection with our classroom practices. So this is early this year in 2023 when some of our colleagues in American universities headed by Kimberly Coates, came out with this groundbreaking essay called Prioritizing Pedagogy in Victorian Studies. And in this essay, they argue that practical discussions about pedagogy in the field of Victorian studies warrant a regular place in major field-based conferences and journals. For instance, like in this conference, we're talking about different approaches in theory. And I'm sure if some of these proceedings are published in a journal, we would also end up, discussing these issues in a theoretical construct to be written down as journal articles. But how do we possibly translate them into classroom pedagogy practices? And in doing so, they are saying that lost it at stake. Not only as early career academicians who have to constantly think in terms of academic performance index, in terms of publications, seminar participation, so on and so forth, but also in terms of the necessity how such academic performance indexes need to bring in how deft and how alert, attentive we are in translating these theories into classroom pedagogies. We need to think in terms of introducing certain perhaps components which would then enable us to think in those terms. So undisciplining trans-imperialism and prioritizing pedagogy are some of the important key constructs which tend to have motivated me to try and contribute in my way to the undisciplining initiative. Now, my research in this field implements these worldviews in shaping a tailor-made course. Can we just go on to the last slide? It's easier that way. Just the last slide. Yeah. So this you can see is the proposal of the peer-reviewed syllabus, and in this way I tend to look at the institutional history of my alma mater, Department of English, Jadavpur University. And Victorian Studies has always been a very core strength of our department. And through a reading of different case studies, I tend to look at how if we tend to break out from the shell of looking at Western literature per se about what Western critics have to talk about Western literature and try to track our own roots, our alternative routes to see what sort of research exists in universities like Jadavpur, like Bardhaman, like Calcutta, like Presidency College, erstwhile no longer exists, but nevertheless, and tend to bring up our own histories of resistance in trying to bring in an alternative model of understanding Victorian studies. So that, for a British Dickens or a British Lawrence, you would have a Bengali Dickens or a Bengali Lawrence, so as to say. And in this way, perhaps proactively, from a very broader understanding of, how English studies comes to India and how from a purely administrative juncture of introducing, English study courses in army cadet colleges, we tend to bring it into dissenting academies and then into colleges and university practices, and then move on to, come down to institutional history, departmental history, and by trying to closely read these micro history practices in our own way, question the sort of truths and philosophies which we tend to come across in our own classroom practices. If I have some more time, I would like to talk a bit more about what I intend to do to this course. So my course presents with a case study of the 19th century group working at Jude since its inception in 1956. The material which has been made available in the Undisciplining Victorian Studies website, which is freely available and is attributed to the Creative Commons notion of making things freely available to the global netizens of this world, has been able to materialize because a large amount of these material were digitized by the students of the department. as a part of a voluntary service and dormant in the department's archive. Such studies, I hope, will be able to offer a very unique perspective of how do we look at the West in Indian academies. And furthermore, it will also, I believe, facilitate an internal cultural shift without devaluing the knowledge systems of the historically marginalized communities. People like us, we had been associated with 19th century studies in India, and I'm sure I will definitely have some colleagues in the learned audience of today. The pertinent question whenever you have to go and appear for, let's say, a scholarship interview is why are you looking at the British authors? Why don't you possibly look at someone closer to the home? And I believe through a change in our way of looking at these British authors, by mediating them through the lens of our own positionality, we will perhaps be able to offer a better response to that question. As I was telling, if you possibly look at, some specific 2 minutes, yes, sir, specific course module, for instance, if you look at, Joshua Dee's work on Europe and the question of modernity, and her own PhD thesis on Walter Pater, you will see that, there are prescribed texts in this, peer-reviewed syllabus, which tells us how to look at this canon of positivism from our own understanding or our own reading of 19th century Bengali women. Same for Manindi's work. When he looks at the British Romantics, he's constantly bringing in, poets from the Bengal Basin to try and replicate, not only give a sort of comparative, larger field work to Victorian studies per se, but also to try and give, let's say, a sort of a Bengali positionality of reading the British Romantics here in the capital of the colonial British Empire. So, re-examining the history of English literary studies in a very specific institutional context like this holds the promise of generating several such models at a micro level. I'm sure so many of us have had, several alma maters in our individual journeys. If we look into our own institutional histories, we'll be able to lay bare several, alternative truths in our own manner. And such analytical framework may also prove to be successful in placing the non-West like ours in an inexhaustible relation of contiguity and interconstitutiveness with the empire out there. Thank you so much, sir.
Fantastic paper. Thank you so much.